added mapping of that particular neural terrain that we have been using under the auspices of acts and facts. There is one particular way that we have not mentioned in the last few times, however, we've been talking about that, and that is an area that life has driven men to believe, to talk about, to write about, that has some supreme potential, significant payoff. No one has any doubt that ever gives any thought to it, and that is in attempting to determine the difference between, bring the music up, between the real and the imaginary. Everybody loves this, even children love it, which shouldn't offend some of you grown-ups who have a borrowed brain. But for those of you so inclined, we could not only shag, but perhaps even move into some kind of five-dimensional foxtrot and take this on under the legend, the map legend of acts and facts. Now, instead of using the words true and imaginary, which is no sense even stopping to deal with for the time being, other than the fact that for those of you that might be hearing this for the one in an early stage in your career, or at least the career of your ears, we're not even engaged in any question, any attack, not giving any negative inflection to the ideas of real and imaginary. They simply go on. They have been going on religion, philosophy, everyday conversation, and you do not have to be in the world of academia to be aware of the fact that someone will turn on someone else in a good old neighborhood bar and say, oh man, it's your imagination. People tell each other that on the basis of sexual relationships. The episodes of life are continued with people making reference to, that's just your imagination, or what you just said is imaginary. Or don't talk to me about such as that. Let's deal with things, real life. It's everywhere. So we're not questioning right now the ultimate validity of the words. Just let them go. You know that people talk about it, and it's not simply philosophical, although I am told that in certain Ivy League or Ivy Towered settings that they do seriously jawbone about reality versus the imaginary. But you should not let that deter you from pursuing it on your own, because it does go on in the general midstream of life's nervous system via man. Now back to, I was going to suggest if you will abandon or move away from the words true and imaginary and try it this way. Instead of saying true and imaginary, say that it is actually so or it is factually so, in our sense of the words now. And consider this, they both exist, but that each one has a different function and they have a completely different support system. It becomes a radical question, if you can begin to see it, that is now, I'm trying to get you to see the energy background behind all of the questions as to whether things are real or imaginary and all the shadings in between. It becomes a, if you can see it, a radical question in this way. That is a way that I'm suggesting you could look at it. It's a question of whether something, whatever is under discussion, and a something can be a noun, a verb, a process, or a thing. And of course, those of you who can really see, you can strike out two of the four I just mentioned. But it becomes a radical question of whether the thing under discussion, if the thing is already operational, or is it, for now, relatively speaking, just talk? That is, just facts. Now, those of you who have been sort of here in physical person and otherwise for the last few times, you know by facts we're not speaking on the basis that something is, in the secondary city sense, provable, scientifically correct, etc. It's simply a fact as opposed to an act, a fact being the singular bird in the coop of the human mind, whereas acts are just dirt, worms, fallen leaves, and they simply are. But now facts, and when I say just talk, again, that is no pejorative reflection on talk. Far be it from any of us to attack talk. But you could ask yourself this kind of radical question on the basis of, because it's in your own internal conversation also, that is, it's part of the movement of life's energy through man, of questions about, well, and it may not seem to be as cut and dried as, well, is this true? Is this real? Or is this imaginary? It's all these little shadings in between of you that many times are not enunciated specifically, but it's on the basis of, should I pursue this? Is this worthwhile? Or is it, as I vaguely remember, I've heard somebody's accused me, or I've accused other people in the past, God forbid you should have such a memory as that, of being involved with interests like this thing. And I thought, Jesus, that's their imagination. People are, simple peckerheads. They don't know what they're doing. They should straighten up, get into something real, like the pennant race this year. But the question comes down to this, if you can see it. The reality behind the verbal question of, is this real or imaginary? Is it by and large real, or is it large part imaginary? It's this. And this would serve no purpose in the ordinary world, because they would have to throw it into the meat grinder. It would be too direct of an energy for ordinary intellect to use. And so, even though the sentence, may I suggest, does make a little sense, they could not use it on the basis, because if I said the radical question comes down to this, is the thing actually in operation, or is it just talk? Now, the ordinary intellect could not make such a distinction to start with. It's got no need to, because if you can talk about something, if I may play the part of ordinary intelligence, I believe you're cut out for it, thank you, then you can say, well, if somebody's talking about it, it is already in operation. And you talk about people stealing our material. I could have told you that. But you've got to be able to see that there is an operational distinction that you can use. Is the thing fully operational? This under discussion. And the sorts of things, I don't think we ever looked at particularly this way, but it gets down to this. If you have to tell somebody, if you have to discuss it, you're not going to see it anyway. So you have just got to be able to see that there are things going on that are already fully functional. Do I have to give you an example? Screwing, eating when hungry, sleeping when tired. They are fully functional. There are other things that, relatively speaking, compared to that, are just talk. Now, people may be doing them, but we're going to get in that in a second. It would be some secondary variation, say, of sex, of eating. But it would be, in a sense, comparably speaking, it would be just talk. That is, it is not fully operational. By fully operational, I could try and get you to more specifically consider it that a kind of definition to something being actually so, like actual reality as opposed to factual reality. And remember, we're using that to substitute for the ordinary terms of whether it's true or whether it's real or whether it's imaginary. That if something, as I was just describing, was already fully operational, then that would be actually so. And to try and stretch the mapping of it, it would be sort of like this, that actual reality, whatever it is on the basis that it requires no, or at least it's not solely dependent upon, facts. That would be operational reality. That would be actual reality. That would be things that are actually so. They operate with no or beyond any dependence. And that last part is actually superfluous, except for those who have superfluous prefrontal lobes. And of course, as some of you may have heard there, some man's working on an apparatus. A debris filter. Actual reality operates on the basis that it requires no facts. Quite simply, is it necessary? And don't you people engaged in replays of 9½, or redoing the life of the Marquis de Sade inside your own bedroom, don't bother to write me. But I was going to give an example of operational, actual reality requiring no facts, that if you know how to do it, I admit it may be tricky in our complex, sophisticated time, but if you know how to do it, you can have sex without talking. And I don't mean just literally at the moment, but you can have sex without any talk between you and the person. I'm assuming it's somebody that's already, that you and the other person has some sort of tacit understanding that, hey, let's take off our clothes and get in bed and have some fun. Or a meal. You can approach a meal. And you don't, when I say no facts are necessary, no talk, it's not simply, although this is not exclusive from it, not excluded from it. When I say sex, when I say it's not just the conversation, the facts between you and the person with whom you're engaging in sex, which some of you might be interested to know, there are ways to do it with another person. It's not just necessary for you to be engaged in a factual, that is a speaking relationship to the other person with sex, but also in here. That, in other words, if you're just engaged in the pure act of sex, if that were still possible, and casting no question upon whatever sexual fantasies ordinary people may have, that's not even the point. But you understand, if you simply engaged in sex, if you simply sat down and ate, not only would that, the factual reality, the actual reality, the kind of operational reality I was trying to point out, not only would it not be based upon, not be necessary for you to have a conversation in the first example between the person you're having sex with, and the second example that you not have to have a conversation with the waiter or with the chef. Like, wait a minute, what's in this food? Not only that, but in here, that if you sat down and you were hungry, that there'd be no conversation going on. It is not based upon facts. That is, of you sitting there and going, Jesus, I wonder how many calories is in this salad dressing. And all the sorts of things that people do. It would be, although it's impossible, and I'm not saying it would be worthwhile, but it would be more as a well-tempered wolf falling upon his food, and he eats. There could be a similar situation if you were good and hungry, and your mind was worn out enough. I'm just dragging this, some of you should catch the point. You're just ravished that you could sit down, stand up, grab your sandwich, eat it, and not only have no discussion that's not even necessary. You don't ask anybody, wait a minute, did a kosher chef fix this? Did an Italian make my meal? Did the person, whoever fixed this salad, were they a Christian? Doesn't even cross your mind. Not only that, but internally, there is no conversation. It's just, I'm hungry, and you grab it and you go. That would be, an a crude example, albeit, that would be a proceedings within the world of actual reality. It is simply not based upon, it is not dependent upon any facts. It just is. No theory is necessary, no discussion, no ideas, no conversation, nothing that would fall within the general heading of a fact. Such an actual reality, such an actual operation does not need outside ideas, outside of its own existence, to exist. There is no proof of its existence. There is no need to prove its existence. And may I point out, for anyone getting glassy-eyed, I am still not trying to move you into any sort of philosophical discussion, or academically or theoretically, because this goes on continually in your life, in the movement of energy in the human nervous system. The existence on an actual basis, as opposed to a factual basis, which, remember, they cannot be separated, and we're doing it arbitrarily just for the sake of this until they get the Bullwinkle and Rocky movies, so they get the film queued up. We're just temporarily doing this. But at the actual level, that you never have any occasion to think about. Man is not arranged and wired up to be thinking about this. Again, not in the academic sense, but even in his ordinary life, which is pertinent. That which exists in a certain way that I am referring to now as actual, it exists without any proof. And I don't mean some logical, I don't mean some philosophical, I don't mean some clinical proof. It exists in the sense that everyone reacts to it without the need of any discussion. They may discuss it, they may not. They may discuss it overtly, they may not. They may discuss it overtly and very little internally, and vice versa, in all the possible combinations. But there is that lingering. As long as you can talk, you can't go backwards without knowing how. You cannot stop it, because once you have started thinking, once you have started talking, even that which we could have described at one time as being a pristine, primary, actual basis can no longer be so. And so you can't really separate it. We're just talking about it, just killing time, being funny and cute. But there is that exists without the help, without the need for any ideas, any theories, any conversation whatsoever. It needs no, in a sense, energy outside of itself, outside of its own existence to exist. No comment is required. There is no way to prove the actual world. I mean, it's very simple to say why. I'll bet it is. The actual world requires no proof. The actual world cannot be proven. Because once you can talk, you can't stop trying to prove it. I mean, even if you said, well, wait a minute, that requires no proof. I hear what you're saying. The good old, just old-fashioned, especially the good missionary American decent position of sex just exists. And that doesn't require anybody talking about it. I think that's known as, one of those other great philosophers, Wilson Pickett, said, I think that's known as, it's too late. Because you can't say, wait a minute, I'm not going to talk about it. You all know that. It's the kind of severe neural tire damage you get from trying to back up. Because you can back up and say, well, I'm not going to talk about it, and therefore, in some way, I'm closer to the intrinsic philosophical, actual basis of it. You can sure say that, if you can remember it. But you cannot back away from the fact that it is now factual. It is in part. There is an operational, I'm not going to stop with this any further, but there is a very operational, functional basis and use for me pointing out that the difference that we're trying to signify tonight behind the words and the ideas of true and imaginary, and us calling it right now for the moment actual soul, actual reality, and factual reality, the actual, its existence is in no wise dependent upon any proof. Its existence, there is no facts outside of its existence that's necessary for it to exist. I repeat one more time, I'm going on with it. There's nothing you can do with that. Even if you get a glimpse of it, there is no practical use of it thus far. Because if you could extract that which would sound to be extraneous, perhaps, in the way I'm describing it, or the way you've heard it thus far, that if you could subtract the factual connection with it now, then you would have something better. No, you wouldn't. You'd be unconscious. No. You'd be suffering from, if it could be noted, severe brain damage, intellectual damage. So think for a second that actual reality does not depend on any ideas, any thought, any facts outside of its own existence to exist. That's where we are now, comma, whereas factual reality is so in a way in which talk about it is absolutely necessary for its existence. Even though we are brutally unconscionably butchering up whatever language it is we're speaking, literally. And all this is arbitrary, artificial, and temporary, as all maps are. Still, as opposed to a kind of actual reality, what humanity has always been thinking about as being some supreme form of the truth, of that which is real, that which in some way we need to find. That was what we was calling the first part of a kind of actual reality, whereas the factual reality, you can get many people, not only philosophers, but people down at the neighborhood bar, in their own way, would also join in and rail against certain kinds of unnecessary palaver, as if there was a necessary kind, but I'll leave that to commentators. I don't know. Get a dictionary. Get a job. As opposed to that kind of reality, a kind of actual reality that requires no facts, no theories, no ideas for its existence. Its existence is its proof, which is no longer sufficient. No one can go back there. No one should go back there. You can't go back there. And if you did, I guess you'd find Faulkner there, and you'd be sorry. And then you and him both could say, well, one of us was wrong. But, who would want to go to the trouble to be enlightened if you had to go to Mississippi anyway? But if you could see past that into the whereas that we started this, factual reality is absolutely dependent upon talk. And what I was going to say is far outside the halls of the philosophy department, ordinary people accuse each other of that. Ordinary people deal in this kind of intellectual currency that some things are just a waste of time to talk about. And especially it gets down to a very crude level as people just tell each other. One of the common historical notes of it is between men and women, supposedly, in the city. There's men telling women, shut up, you talk too much, or, quit bugging me. People tell kids that. You should answer a question, kid. Why? Well, it's because the sky's blue. Why? Why is it because it's up high? Why is it up high? Jesus, shut up. But down at a bar, two guys that seem to be equal. Ordinary guy have a couple of beers, he's at least equal to his wife or his kid. That's why you're going to have... And a couple of guys, they get to talking, and they'll say something about the ball game going on or some movie they're watching, and some guy keep talking, and somebody finally turned to him and say, would you shut up? And the man talking hasn't said anything. He's not insulting them personally, but people, what I want you to see, you know it, you just never think about it in a certain way. It's not that there is a specific useful basis of attacking excessive talk on the part of other people, but it happens. But if you stop an ordinary person in the midst of this kind of confrontation, and you say, well, why are you bothering that guy? Well, he keeps on talking. I don't mind people talking, that's not my business, but he keeps on bad-mouthing the A's. He keeps on talking about it, that all actors are probably sissies on the side. And I resent that, because one time I was in a little theater. And I highly resent that. Anyway, they would have a purpose. They would have a conclusion. They would say there was some basis for it. And there is no basis other than what I am hinting to you. That it is already in the wiring of life, in the movement of energy, that at times, when it comes out at the secondary level, in the factual reality, is that people will even accuse one another that you're talking too much about this. Not just in general, not that you just talk too much, which then you got to move to other areas from Detroit and Wilson Pickett into the southern areas of philosophy. How do we start off? Go off Joe Jones. I don't know. You don't worry about it? No. It was a song you talk too much. Never mind. Jesus. J.J. Jones. It is not just the blanket attack that humanity or my wife or my mother-in-law or my boss or my husband talks too much. People will turn on one another, and they may not use these words, but they'll be discussing something that they both seem interested in. The sale of a car. The possible two guys going in business. Let's start our own little business. It can be things down at a very non-academic street level, and yet people have the impression oftentimes that, well, you're talking about this too much. The secondary world cannot exist. There is ultimately no such thing as too much talk. And this has nothing to do with individual occasions. And, of course, do not write me and say, Dear Dr. Kyroot, my wife talks too much, and I was about to leave her. And wait a minute, if I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to get stuck here, and my ears are going to get worn out. It has nothing to do with individual circumstances, because you may indeed find that some person you're around may talk too much. But the secondary world, the factual world, is absolutely dependent upon talk to exist. Was where this whereas started. Religion, art, politics, social position, civilization itself, ordinary intelligence, all of it. Everything that makes man unique. Civilized existence, the secondary world, and all that entails, is absolutely dependent upon facts. And it's not as obvious as you might think, and it's surely not as non-worthy of any observation as some of you might think. There is no way, ultimately, to talk too much about religion, to talk too much about art, to talk too much about personal relationships. And don't tell me about I did try to pick up this girl and have a personal relationship, and she, talked me to death. We've been through that one. Hey, you look good. Are you a Leo? Yes, I am. Hey, you want to go screw? Your place or mine? Well, hell, if you're going to talk me to death, forget it. Not that. For those of you that are of a judicial, logistic, never mind. Even that's too obscure. There is no way to talk too much about any aspect of the secondary world, of factual reality. It is impossible to talk too much. Looked at another way, the secondary world, every aspect of it, with no attack intended, as you know. But think about all the arts, sciences, religion, interpersonal relationships. Everything that exists that is singular, just take as you see it, on this planet, everything that is unique to the world of man, as opposed, let us say, to a beaver. Everything, from the highest art down to Mad Magazine, from Haydn to Dan Fogelberg. That's right. From the highest to the lowest. From the Beaux-Arts down to making little figures of dead presidents out of popcorn and chewing gum. Just remember, was why I warned you, don't just glance and say, well, yeah. That is all the factual world, as opposed to an actual world if they could exist apart. Because the factual world, no matter, and it can be to ordinary people, as you know, so glorious as to be the full religious, spiritual experience of being in a stained glass atmosphere on a warm spring morning with the ritual and the music and the incense. And it is a singular experience to many people. There's no doubt about it. Many people get their own version of they find it to be the Reva Aris to sit down and read Milton, Shakespeare. And they find it to be, indeed, almost a transcendental nervous system experience. Just remember this. It is not an actual experience. It's real. It's just as real as anything else. It's as real. It exists as much. Let me put it that way. It exists as much as what may appear to be the most basic, primary acts, such as sex. The listening to Beethoven it exists as much. To call it a secondary experience, to call it part of a factual reality, is no wise to distract from, is no way to question, etc. It exists as much as eating to stay alive, as the sex act. But, notice, the former, an actual reality, that which humanity keeps wanting to feel around and is driven to believe that there is going to be some consequential reward to finding the difference between real and imaginary, or at least to narrow down one scope of it, to get this question more clearly focused. Behind it is what we're discussing tonight as actual and factual reality. The factual, from all the examples I gave that would appear to be from the high to the low areas back in the city, they exist only through the grace of facts. They exist as much as the actual world, but they exist only through the grace of facts. None of it. The religious experience that many people say this, and I don't mean in some mystical way, just what I was describing of how good I feel to go to church, how good I feel to go through the rituals, how good I feel to avail myself of the arts. None of that would exist without facts. Therefore, the facts cannot be overdone. Therefore, ergo, there is no end to facts. There is no permanent, conclusive painting, symphony, religion. There is no experience that is collateral to availing oneself of any of those secondary activities, that is, the flow of energy at that level. That is what I was hoping that you would see as being the distinction. It is a closer detailing of the kind of energetic reality behind the ideas that things can be either more real or less real. It's not that. That is a very crude way. It's understandable, but it is still a very crude, small peephole in the fabric of trying to see, well, there's something behind that idea. I just feel there is. And even if you don't feel there is or think about it, theoretically and academically, you accuse others of falling into the trap of confusing that which is more real and less real. But the whole, you don't need the individual examples, is that the whole spectrum of civilized secondary existence, the factual world, factual reality, is absolutely dependent upon the existence of facts, of talk. It cannot exist apart from. Not that the other actual world could any longer exist apart from, you understand? But now this one could not literally exist now apart from. It not only is its existence absolutely dependent upon talk about it, but you could say that the secondary, the factual world cannot survive without the breath of conversation. I can shrug and say again, I thought I made it crude enough, but you do understand. Anyone who may be listening and seeing this on purpose. There is absolutely no judgment, criticism involved with this statement. But you do understand, I'm just pick out religion because to most people, even those who are not religious, they understand that that seems to be one of the most complex, non-physical experiences that men have. And of course, some people that would admit that in the city say, yeah, but it's mostly imaginary. But still, they would admit something happens to these people, so I'm picking that. The point is, something that seems to be very non-physical, non-routine, as religion, you simply understand this. It wouldn't exist unless you talked about it. It's as clear as that. Whereas, may I suggest to you, sex is suddenly some kind of gaseous cloud swept over this planet and people couldn't talk anymore. May I suggest that everything being equal, which it wouldn't be, everything being equal and then not being equal and thus stretching reality like bubble gum, it swept through and nobody could talk anymore. I suggest to you that would not stop hanky-panky. That would not stop people from eating. It would not stop just because you found yourself, I can't speak, no one can speak, I'm not even sure what speech was, but boy, things are completely different now. May I suggest that if you suddenly found yourself tired, you would not hesitate. There would be no way that you would not lay down and go to sleep on the basis of, wait a minute, I can't lay down and sleep because I can't talk anymore. The survival of the secondary world breathes off of the atmosphere of conversation. That which is now existing in the factual world, the secondary world, only does so because whatever the factual entity seems to be, the factual thing. The only reason it exists and survives is because people talk about it. If people quit talking about it, it goes to live with Elvis and dinosaurs. I guess we could get really off the track, since we haven't gotten off the track much, believe it or not, tonight, because throughout history, things disappear and nobody notices it. Not acts, which is not history anyway, but important stuff at one time just disappears. Not important actual stuff, but important factual stuff, which is just as important. But important factual stuff disappears constantly. You know, forget your socks in the dryer and all that crap. But nobody notices it. Well, why don't they? Because they quit talking about it. Well, why did it disappear? Same reason. Or, those of you who are getting good, they quit talking about it because it needed to disappear. But there is one way. The dinosaurs, if you could look at it metaphorically, since I pull that out, the question about what happened to dinosaurs. You understand? Now, don't take this to be absolutely physical and tangible of dinosaurs. How about the good old days when people were decent? What happened to them? Of course, the dinosaurs, there are all sorts of theories about comets coming by, that their bodies got too heavy for their brains, which I don't think it would serve some of us well to ponder that too long, in case you get the willies. But looked at in a more symbolic sense, look at all the things that do disappear. And I picked out just a general heading, the good old days, because everyone's nervous system, the old man and everyone, ordinary people, is the good old days, I regret to say, are going behind us. And in fact, some aspects of when you could leave your door unlocked, when you could trust your wife at home without your neighbors, all of that stuff. And everyone's nervous system, the old man says somewhere, no matter how enlightened, sophisticated they try to be, that some of the dinosaurs are just gone. And how do you explain it? Especially if you're not religious, or you don't believe in some kind of original sin, or you don't believe that there are demons hiding under everyone's bed and under your porch. How do you explain that things that were at one time of some importance are just gone? I'll tell you why they're gone. Not why, you understand, we're too busy to go into all those subterranean areas. They're gone because no one talks about them, or vice versa. Because anything that's secondary. Now, dinosaurs, do you understand there have been great religions, great cultures that just disappeared? How about those guys that drove themselves crazy? I say that. They made a living off of it. Did Troy actually exist? Did the city exist? I'll go find it. And somebody said, no, you didn't find it. What you found was the leftovers of some Walgreens drugstore that went out of business. But there seems to be, of course it gets into these occult and mystical tributaries of the great civilizations, whole great theories, religions, that the little artifacts we find seem to have had some great insight. They just went and disappeared. And people go, why? And then Time Life goes, write a book, son. We'll send it out for those big bucks. But they go, what happened? They're just little traces of it. I just feel it. And it just disappeared. Look at it this way. No matter what it was, and I was still back using religion as just in the general institutional sense, would seem to be high level in its complexity, in its separation from everyday, down in the dirt, rolling around, humping, eating, defecating, sleeping, that this would be something much more complex. But notice this. It cannot literally exist without you talking about it. And once any area, no matter how important it may seem in retrospect, no matter that there may be some, at the time, contemporary notes made that have survived, that it seemed to be important at the time, if it disappeared, if it dinosaured out, notice this. The talk about it ceased. I don't know how I can make that any clearer. God, don't tell me that. Now consider this. Surely some of you heard that. Think about it, it's not that weird. And it's not that simple. Well, it is that simple, but don't overlook it. The secondary world, no matter how important it is, if it is not what we're describing, not actual reality, that is, its existence, is in no wise dependent upon anything outside of its existence, no facts, then everything else is dependent upon you talking about it. After, God, what is it, 55 weeks? Minutes. Can you see any possible significance to all of the black night of the soul, or believing that Camus has come back as a killer whale, or as a killer philosopher, and he's taken over your brain, and you have all these dastardly thoughts, self-destructive thoughts. I feel terrible. I feel bad. If I felt any worse, I could be a Baptist. Think about this. And people want to go out, not you people, of course, surely, but people want to go out and be analyzed, consider converting to another religion, considering having their tires rotated. But on the basis that some change could be made here in the factual world, and maybe I should talk about it less, maybe I should talk about it more, and what if it's something else? Much more original, much more complex, much more simple, much more direct. You don't mean, you're not going to give me, we've already ripped off Henny Youngman once tonight, so am I going to conclude? Why not? A man goes to a psychiatrist, and in some way he can project what they in the city laughingly refer to as their mind, in some way like up on a screen. And the psychiatrist says, well, we've only got 30 seconds, kid. What can I do to help you? And the man, non-verbally even, projects up this image of his own mentation, the talking of his nervous system that says, it hurts when I do that. It hurts when I talk about that. It hurts when I think about that. And the psychiatrist, having only 9 seconds left, and being my kind of guy, the psychiatrist looks off, and he knows what to tell the guy, and he goes, Jesus, I can't charge that man $200 and tell him that.